My name is Bruno Simão. I'm a specialist property attorney by profession. I've been doing this now for about 20 odd years. I've been with SAPIN for pretty much half of them, so about 10 years with SAPIN. I specialize in property, but not simply from a conveyancing perspective. It's more about the deal making. It's more about the investments. It's more about putting the commercials together and making sure that they make sense. So every time investors come up with ideas, my job is to stress test them. My job is to see if they work, if they don't work, is to monitor them and come back and speak to people about them, try and improve them. So that's my job. It's more in the corporate commercial space. So I have BSA Law and I have Intelligence, the two ladies right there from BSA Law and Intelligence. So if you do have any questions, it's Lisa and Kanye. Please feel free to ask them and approach them at any point this evening. Any questions that you do have, any services that you might need, just go ahead and let them know. In addition to being an attorney, I'm also a property investor. I actually own the Buzz with Andrew Walker, and that's about eight short-term rentals right there. So I'm also very much involved in the investment space. So aside from that, I've got a couple of other investments, multi-lets and buildings, but specifically in the short-term rental space. At the moment, I've got 8, so not close to Miguel, but yeah, in fairness, those 8 keep me busy, so I'm okay. Like I'm done. All right, so there's two ways of acquiring an investment unit and implementing a strategy of short-term rentals, right? So this is intuitive. You either buy the unit and you run the rentals, or what we call rental arbitrage, right? So the point of today is I'm going to be discussing a number of legal, tax, and insurance issues when it comes to short-term rental. So it's not just going to be about rental arbitrage, but I did want to start by having a conversation around the acquisition methods and the actual operational processing methods. So if you buy it, you own it, and now you run it as a business. So how can you run a short-term rental without owning the property? You basically rent it out. Now, so think about it from a joint venture perspective, right? Don't focus too much on the word lease and what is a lease and how does it work. Think about taking an asset that somebody has and adding value to it and utilizing it for your own purposes, right? They don't know what they're doing with it. They don't know how to use it. You know how to use it better than them. So you've decided now you're going to take it over for a certain period of time. You're going to build it up and you're going to benefit from having done that. So a number of considerations that you need to have is, number one, you need to be confident in your abilities that you can actually do that. Number two, bear in mind, especially in places like Cape Town, the people that own these properties are very much aware that there's money to be made in holiday accommodation and short-term rentals. So it's not that you're going to go in there and you're going to find this gem that no one realizes is a gem. There has to be a reason, and you have to ask the question, why are they willing to rent this property out to you and not do this themselves? And if the answer to that is maybe they're retired, they don't care. I mean, when we bought the Buzz as an example, we saw that at that moment that business wasn't doing well. But it wasn't because it wasn't doing well, it was because she didn't care. She was there, she was alone, she didn't have the energy, she didn't want to make the effort, she wanted to go abroad and visit a family. So for us, that was perfect. So that was a motivated seller. So we speak about motivated sellers being those deals that you can get into where it's not that it's a bad deal, it's that the seller didn't have the energy or the inclination to actually do something with it. So be very careful with rental arbitrage. Because signing a lease agreement seems easy, but committing yourself in Cape Town to a property that costs 100,000 Rand, and we had that the other day, 100,000 Rand a month, but in quiet months you were going to make no money, and you were hoping and praying that in peak season you're going to make all that money back. Because now you tied yourself down to what, a 6-month lease, a 12-month lease? So just bear that in mind, right? You're signing a lease with someone who wants rental consistency. So the upside for them is there is no question of failure. They are going to receive rent each and every month, no matter how your business does. So the risk sits entirely on you. So when you enter into those leases, you have to be confident of your abilities, because if the risk sits with you and something goes wrong, that rent still has to be paid. All right? So the beauty with rental arbitrage is you've got a skill that they might not have, and that is it's basically performing a function. It's implementing a function. It's performing that skill set of yours. So it's important that you invest in acquiring that skill, because you have to have one up over this person that couldn't do it themselves. Now, from a legal perspective, it is typically a rental agreement. So you sign a lease and you've got a fixed term over this lease. So it could be 6 months, could be 12 months. Typically, it'd never be more than 2 years. Your general leases are around 12 months. So over 12 months, you have to pay a fixed amount of rent. There are deviations to this, and I'll chat to you about these just now. But think about your normal long-term accommodation lease agreement. Now, just bear in mind, most lease agreements do not allow for subletting, right? So you don't just sign a normal lease agreement that the rental agent gave you and start running an Airbnb from it. It does not allow for subletting. Most don't. You have to get consent. So the last thing you want is to enter into a lease agreement only later to find out in the lease agreement there's a prohibition. And that's a big one. There's a lot of things you can get away with, but the very, very big one is the fact that there's a prohibition. Also, bear in mind, most lease agreements limit who can stay on the property. So the lease agreements I draft and I hand out to my clients specify to the T the names of the individuals that can stay on that property and the number of people that can stay on that property. Anyone else is considered a guest that's short term, not consistently a guest that's short term. So if you're limited in this agreement to a certain amount of people or a certain individuals, again, now you're going to get into trouble if you're trying to run short-term accommodation from it. So these aren't standard lease agreements. There are things in this lease agreement that you need to keep in mind, and you need to make sure that you adapt properly. My advice is have the open conversation with the landlord, right? There's a lot of people that would say, look, maybe they don't realize what you could do with this property, so enter into the lease, and now you're going to make a killing, and they're going to live and regret that they could have done that, but they didn't. Again, I assure you, in Cape Town, it's highly unlikely that that landowner does not know about Airbnb and does not know there's a market for it. So there's a reason he's doing it. You have to be open about what your intention is, because sometimes you'll even get feedback from him as to why he thinks it won't work. The lease agreement needs to be open enough that you can do with the property as you please. You need to have conversations also about what if you do improvements to the property, right? Or if the property is not ready to be taken to market as an Airbnb and certain things need to be done. Now you're crossing over from your normal residential lease into a commercial lease, because there's huge differences between the two. So when we do commercial leases for office spaces, retail spaces, shops, that sort of thing, a lot is around what a person contributes to that property. Because either it's a capital outlay that stays on the property that the landlord is going to benefit from. In commercial space, you can actually get the landlord to contribute towards that capital outlay because he's going to get the ultimate benefit from it. So you need to bear in mind that if you're putting money into the property itself, chances are you're not going to get it back. You better get it back in returns, because the landlord's not going to pay you for the improvements to those properties. You can take the furniture, but you can't take the ceilings and the light fixtures and everything that you put in there. That's stuck. So this lease agreement has to cater for that. How are you going to deal with the installations? Is the landlord going to compensate you ahead of time? Is there going to be no compensation? Is it entirely in your hands? You do with it as you please. You have to have this conversation in the lease. So open conversation in the lease agreement is absolutely, absolutely crucial. And that is ultimately the rental arbitrage, is don't approach it as a stock standard agreement. It's a conversation with the landlord and then how you implement your strategy. And what I mentioned earlier is there's certain variations or deviations from this. Sometimes it's not about lease agreements, as an example. Sometimes you can approach it as a joint venture. So maybe the owner lives abroad and doesn't have the energy to do anything with the property. He'd love someone locally that's able to actually implement a strategy. So you go to them and say, that's fine. So what we do is we create short-term accommodation. Let's cover the operational expenses, and then we'll share the profits 50-50, right? So now they carry an upside. It could be more than the rent they would receive consistently or not, but at least now your risk is limited. And again, it's not a bad conversation to have if the person is willing to do it. And again, if they're motivated, if the right motivation is there, why wouldn't they do it, knowing that they could actually get an upside if you do really, really well with the business? So that kind of collaboration agreement, profit share, whatever you want to call it, joint venture, it's a deviation from your typical rental arbitrage, but it works the same. The only difference is you're not placing yourself in a position where now you're bound to a certain monthly payment. But again, depends on the negotiations that you had. So we did one the other day where it was a JV. The landlord or the owner charged cost, basically. He said, at minimum, I want you to cover the property rates. I want you to cover the body corporate levies. And then I won't charge you anything over that. My rental is calculated entirely on a percentage of the profits that we make. And anyone that's dealt with commercial funding or in commercial leases, this starts sounding very similar, because that's exactly what happens in commercial leases, where your rent is calculated on value of turnover, as an example, right? It works very similar. You're running a business here. This isn't your normal accommodation. So you need to think of it very differently to how you do normal, like long-term lease agreements. Now, aside from the actual rental arbitrage, so now this conversation is whether you're doing a rent-to-rent or whether you own the property. Remember, short-term rentals are businesses. And because they're businesses, they work subject to the same rules that most businesses work under. So think hotel, think guest house, same type of concept. So we spoke about lease agreements, things like zoning, for example. Some municipalities, some councils have specialized zoning. Depending on how many units you have on one property, it's a special type of zoning. You cannot assume that just because you have a property, whether you own it or rent it, you can now put 5 families in there and start renting it out as short-term accommodation. That's simply not the case. So the same rules that apply for a business that wants to run a business from a particular property is exactly what you would need to now look at. Now, I don't do town planning, so this is a conversation to have with Saskia and explore what one would be looking for in a property and what sort of zoning requirements there are. But this is more about getting the red flags in place, because as a legal issue, again, you do rental arbitrage, the landlord doesn't care. He says, yeah, sure, you go put 3 units here and rent them out, short-term accommodation, I don't mind. But are you actually allowed to? And have you had the conversation with him regarding that? Body corporates. So this is quite a controversial issue. I've actually represented quite a few clients. 15 minutes, thank you. I've actually represented quite a few clients in the space that had units in certain schemes that, well, the one scheme, so I can't mention names, so let me try to say it without mentioning a name. There was one scheme that actually had a hotel in the scheme itself. So it was a very nice scheme. It had long-term accommodation, so people were able to buy units there and live there themselves. And then they had a hotel. And one day they called a meeting, they called the AGM, and they prohibited short-term rental accommodation, right? And it became a massive competition issue, because the question there was, why are you doing it? You've got people coming in and out anyway, because there's short-term accommodation using the hotel, but now you're denying residents or owners the right to be able to do that. So that matter was settled. So nothing came of it. There was no case law around it. But then there was a case that went before the court where a specific body corporate passed a rule, again, prohibiting short-term rentals. And again, the one owner decided he approached CSOS first, and then he went to court, and he wanted to get a ruling from the court. And the court's approach there is no standard rule to say that a body corporate can or can't prohibit short-term rental accommodation. However, their reasoning is key. They cannot do it for the wrong reasons. They cannot do it in bad faith. So they can't do it just to get back at someone because it does infringe ownership rights. And even if you're a minority, South Africa is one of the few countries that still has certain protections against, well, not against minorities, but you know what I mean, in favor of minorities. And we're one of the few countries that still have that. But if the majority is meant to rule, and there's good reason for the majority to rule, you cannot go and attack every decision the majority made. In this specific instance, this was a lifestyle estate. People wanted to know who was there. They wanted to know who had access to the property. The kids were running around in the street. They did not want people in and out. The whole idea was they didn't want parties. It was meant for retirement. And they justified to the court that from a security perspective and a lifestyle perspective, this is why the majority bought into this estate. And it wouldn't be fair to introduce now new elements into the estate that they have no control over. And remember just one thing, Airbnb is one platform. So when you speak about short-term accommodation, and we speak about Airbnb courses, right? Airbnb course is just the way of doing short-term accommodation. So is Booking.com. But there's a lot of short-term accommodation that isn't done properly. So you cannot guarantee the quality of tenant, short-term tenant or transient client that is going to go into this property. So as a lifestyle estate, you cannot expect people that are sitting there in retirement to be happy with strangers coming in and out. And we had this conversation on another matter that I was dealing with. And there, what actually happened is we settled by convincing the body corporate not to prohibit entirely, but to put measures in place to better control. So the body corporate had control over what platforms were being utilized, the quality of tenant that was coming in, the entrance and access that the tenant had, how long they were going to stay for, where they parked, a whole range of different things. And that did help that body corporate. So it's not a yes or no, but when you're doing your due diligence, you have to make sure that you ask the right questions. Because if this body corporate has a trend against a short-term accommodation, you can almost promise yourself that in a couple of years, there might be a vote prohibiting it. And if you're the only person in that entire scheme that intends to run short-term rental units, you're going to have a big fight on your hands if no one else is in your favor. If there's a lot of other people, then I suppose you can take some solace in knowing that there's going to be a bunch of you fighting that battle together. But if not, be very careful. Check the rules, check the tendency, the trend, how people approach it, and if there's a case to be made out that it's not, that it would be unfair to prohibit it, and that's why you bought into the scheme. CPA, Consumer Protection Act, we all know it. Just bear in mind that you are offering a service. And if you're the owner and you're offering a service and you're carrying on a business by offering the service, CPA is going to apply. So you're going to be on that other end. So you do something wrong, they can lay complaints against you. They can go to the commission if they want to go to the commission. They can ask for their money back. So just same rules that you all know, that you've possibly used in the past, are going to be used against you. Again, you're running a business. So remember, now you're business owners, you're entrepreneurs, and you need to act like business owners and entrepreneurs. And unfortunately, those rights that you had as a consumer are now going to be used against you. VAT and tax implications. Again, you're running a business, right? If you hit that threshold, so commercial accommodation, let me maybe start here. Residential accommodation versus commercial accommodation. Two different things in South Africa. So residential accommodation is to promote housing. It's VAT exempt. They don't expect property owners to charge VAT, and they don't expect lessees to pay VAT, right? So they keep that cost down. It's completely exempt. Commercial accommodation is business. SARS makes money from business. SARS wants people to pay VAT when it comes to commercial accommodation. If you're close to that 1 million rand threshold and you're doing short-term rentals, you have to register for VAT because it is commercial accommodation. What does commercial accommodation mean? In a nutshell, it's basically when you're offering the space where a bed goes together with the bed, together with the electricity, the water and everything else, and all these other amenities. So it's the services in addition to the space where somebody could actually live. And provided that you offer this lodging, so they call it lodging, right? Somebody can come in and they can stay there without bringing anything and they're entirely comfortable. All services are provided, all inclusive. That's commercial accommodation, right? You have to register. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about now mixed use as an example, where part of your property is residential, part of your property is commercial, and how you're now going to actually allocate the VAT, because that does get complicated, but it can be done. So if you have one property that does both, you have to pay VAT on the one side of the services and the other side is exempt. Just make sure that your expenses are properly noted, because part of it you can claim input tax and the other part you can't claim input tax, right? But we will get to that. I'm sure somebody will ask a question later on that. So residential versus commercial, you have to register. There is one reprieve, if you want to put it like that. So it's section 1010, if I'm not mistaken, of the VAT Act, says that if it's commercial accommodation, but it's over 28 days, you don't have to charge the full VAT amount. You can charge 60% of the VAT amount. So that's an effective rate of around 9%. So you still have to charge VAT. You still have to be registered for VAT. You just charge a lower VAT amount past 28 days. So it's just one of those things that not a lot of people know. And the reason I mention it is even if you do know, and even if your accountants know, the tracking is very difficult, because it doesn't just come automatically. These systems don't always recognize that certain guests need to be charged differently to other guests. And there are settings, but you need to go into the listings, you need to find the setting, and you need to specify in that setting what happens if it's more than 28 days. Or you need to have your accountant do it, and you need to now, and if you're using a system that doesn't automatically cater for it, it's going to be very difficult. Right? But it's just something worth thinking about. You can get away with charging slightly less VAT, which obviously makes your guests stay a little bit cheaper. So it's not the worst idea. You just need to make sure that your system actually caters for it. Then lastly, insurance risks. Just things to think about. A lot, like Airbnb, for example, comes with some insurance cover in favor of the host. But what you do need to bear in mind is insurance policies aren't all alike. When you buy a property and you buy it with a home loan and it's a residential property and you go to your normal household insurance and they give you this policy, you need to make 100% sure you can actually run a business from it. Because it's very different to having a house where you invite guests and somebody slips and falls and you've got public liability insurance, versus actually running a business where you need proper public liability insurance. Cars get stolen, people slip, people fall. You have to cover yourself. So you always need to make sure that you've got the right policy in place. It might cost you a little bit extra, but it definitely is worth it rather than getting a void claim, right? So insurance policies for body corporates, there was one or two instances where the body corporate actually required a different insurance policy, so they had certain conditions they expected the person dealing with Airbnb, so the owner in that instance, to have. So also worth asking, but normally you'd find that the body corporates would tell you if they want something, so you don't need to go figure it out yourself. But if it's your own insurance policy, the last thing you want is to submit a claim, mention that now you're running a Airbnb from the property, and then have your claim rejected for some reason or another because it wasn't covered for that sort of commercial, those sort of commercials. So that's basically the summary of it. So just the practical tips. If you are doing rental arbitrage, written agreement with owner. If you're just running the short-term rentals, make sure you have supplier contracts in place. You got your cleaners, you got your service providers, make sure everything's there. Verify your permissions, so that's municipal compliance, body corporates. Make sure your insurance covers is properly in place, and then remember VAT. Remember, at some point or another, you might need to register for VAT. Remember that VAT actually isn't one of those taxes that everyone hates, because you get to claim input from it. So even though you have to charge VAT, your expenses, now on your expenses, you get to claim input tax. Sometimes it actually does work out, depending on what your expenses are, how much money you've actually spent on this property and how much money you spend on a monthly basis. And what you find in many, many instances is if your service providers are VAT registered, that every service you pay, you get to claim input back from. So yeah, just bear that in mind. So even at the Buzz, voluntarily, we registered for VAT, because when we bought the property, we actually got to claim notional input tax. Now, I'm not going to discuss that tonight because that's quite a long one, but there was a benefit. There was a benefit that I could claim something back, so I decided to register for VAT. So don't be VAT averse just for the sake of it. It's not always a bad idea. It depends what your expenses are on the other end.